Officer Brian Harkins approached the bench, his steps heavy with suspicion. The park was serene, children's laughter echoed in the distance, but Brian's eyes were locked on Marcus, who sat there too calmly, a stillness that unnerved him. Marcus closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, meeting Brian's gaze with a steady, unflinching look. "Afternoon," Brian said, his tone polite but edged with something darker. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm, his hands resting on the closed book in his lap, visible. He knew the drill. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book, searching for something, anything. Marcus didn't flinch. "Just enjoying the park," he said simply. Brian's brow furrowed, his gut nagging at him. The park had been his beat for over 2 decades. He knew everyone who came and went. But Marcus? He didn't belong here. Not like this. Too calm, too quiet, too composed. "You from around here?" Brian asked, his voice tightening, as if searching for a crack in Marcus's calm exterior. Marcus gave a small, controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The answer irritated Brian. He shifted his stance, his hand moving unconsciously toward his baton. "Mind if I see some ID?" The request hung in the air, heavy with implied authority. Marcus's smile faded. He knew this moment, the turning point, the decision that could send this encounter spiraling. He took a breath, steady and deliberate. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice measured, calm, but it was the question that sent a sharp edge through Brian's patience. Brian bristled, his hand tightening on his baton. There was that calmness again. That refusal to be afraid. It crawled under his skin, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Brian shot back, his hand now resting on the holster of his gun. Marcus kept his hands visible, his eyes steady on Brian's. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's patience snapped. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he growled, stepping closer, looming over Marcus. But even Brian knew the excuse was weak, flimsy, barely holding together under the weight of his assumptions. Marcus didn't move, didn't react. "And what description is that?" His voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but the words sliced through the air. Brian's jaw clenched. He didn't have an answer, and he knew it. But he couldn't back down. Not now. The tension between them thickened, as the world around them seemed to fall silent, waiting for what would come next. Brian's grip on his baton tightened as the tension in the air became almost palpable. He could feel the eyes of onlookers starting to gather, watching this interaction unfold. Marcus still hadn't moved, his calm gaze never wavering, but that only made Brian more agitated. "You think you're smart, huh?" Brian snapped, his voice lower now, but filled with frustration. "Show me your ID. Now." Marcus inhaled slowly, deliberately. The situation was escalating exactly as he had feared. He kept his hands in plain view, moving them slowly to retrieve his wallet. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus said, his voice measured as he extended his ID. "But I don't have to explain myself for sitting in a public park." Brian snatched the ID out of his hand without a word, his eyes scanning it quickly, though his mind was elsewhere, already trying to justify his next move. The name on the ID meant nothing to him. This guy could be anyone, and his calmness, his audacity to remain composed, just made Brian more determined. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back just enough to give Marcus space, his hand inching toward the handcuffs on his belt. The onlookers had multiplied now, whispers passing through the small crowd gathering near the trees. A man recording the incident on his phone stepped closer. Marcus looked at Brian, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was how it always happened. Despite everything he'd accomplished, he was just another black man under suspicion. But there was no fear in his eyes, only frustration and weariness. He stood slowly, complying, his hands still visible as he rose to his feet. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said quietly, his voice firm but calm. But Brian had already made up his mind. He grabbed Marcus's arm roughly, spinning him around. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists, the sensation all too familiar. The crowd murmured in disapproval, but Brian tuned it out. His pride wouldn't let him stop now. As he tightened the cuffs, a strange feeling crept into Brian's chest. A small voice in the back of his mind told him something wasn't right. But he pushed it down. He needed to control this situation. He needed to prove he was in charge. Brian led Marcus toward the squad car, gripping his arm tightly. Marcus didn't resist. He didn't speak. His calm demeanor remained, which only made Brian more unsettled. It wasn't supposed to go like this. The suspect was supposed to be afraid, compliant. But Marcus was neither. As Brian opened the back door of the patrol car and guided Marcus inside, he stole a glance at the man he had just arrested. Marcus met his gaze, his eyes still steady, unflinching. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice low but clear. Brian slammed the door shut without responding, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked around to the driver's seat, the unease he'd been suppressing began to surface again, creeping into his thoughts. Something felt wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. He started the car, pulling out of the park, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as the city streets blurred past them. In the rearview mirror, Brian glanced at Marcus, who sat calmly in the back seat, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "What were you really doing in that park?" Brian asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Marcus's expression didn't change. He met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his tone unbothered. "I told you. I was just reading." Brian scoffed, his frustration mounting. "A guy like you? Just reading in the park," he challenged, his words laced with thinly veiled prejudice. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me?" he repeated, his voice controlled, daring Brian to confront what he was implying. Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, as the precinct came into view. As they pulled into the station's lot, that nagging feeling in Brian's gut deepened. Something was off, and he could no longer ignore it. When they entered the precinct, Officer Jenkins stood at the booking desk, his eyes widening slightly as Brian led Marcus inside. Jenkins glanced at the ID Brian handed him, recognition flickering across his face before he quickly masked it. Brian," Jenkins said, his voice hesitant. "You might want to take this one up to Captain Bennett." Brian frowned, confused. "Why?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Jenkins looked nervously at Marcus, then back at Brian. "Just trust me on this one. Take him to Bennett." Brian's stomach dropped. Something was very, very wrong. He led Marcus down the hall toward Captain Bennett's office, the unease in his chest growing heavier with each step. When they reached her door, Brian knocked once before opening it. Captain Bennett looked up from her desk, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Marcus. Her expression shifted for just a moment, a flicker of recognition, but she quickly regained her composure. "Officer Harkins," she said, her voice even. "What's going on here?" "I brought this guy in from the park," Brian said, his voice faltering slightly. "He was acting suspicious, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, who stood calmly beside Brian, his hands still cuffed. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Officer Harkins," she began slowly, "do you have any idea who this man is?" Brian blinked, his confusion deepening. He's a suspect," he said, though even he knew how weak that sounded now. Captain Bennett stood up, her expression serious. "This suspect is Special Agent Marcus Davis. FBI." Brian's world tilted as Captain Bennett's words hit him. FBI? The man he had cuffed was a federal agent. His heart pounded, palms sweating. Marcus stood beside him, calm and unreadable. "Special agent?" Brian whispered. "Yes, Officer Harkins," Bennett said, her tone sharp. "Marcus Davis is a top FBI agent." She shook her head. "You didn't even check." Brian felt exposed. He glanced at Marcus, hoping for anger or disdain, but Marcus remained calm. Captain Bennett sighed. "Agent Davis, I apologize. This shouldn't have happened." Marcus nodded. "This isn't just about me," he said firmly. Brian's stomach dropped. "Wait outside," Bennett ordered. Brian left, his mind racing. He had profiled an FBI agent, and his career now hung in the balance. Inside, Marcus and Bennett discussed deeper issues. "This is about respect for everyone," Marcus said before leaving. Outside, Brian waited. When Marcus emerged, he said quietly, "I hope you understand the weight of this moment." Brian nodded, unable to speak, left alone with his guilt. This was a reckoning.